In this section of the course, we'll begin our close examination of the American School of Archaeology and how this particular branch of research in the United States fits within the overarching discipline of anthropology. Archaeologists will ask important questions, including how do people acquire the resources they need to survive from the local environment? A second question, if culture is the most important of human adaptations, then how can we understand it from its material byproducts? What physically defines these byproducts? What do these products tell us about the psychology of those who made them? And how are these cultural materials organized into the terrestrial spaces of the planet? A third major question is how we imprint our own culture on the study of past peoples or communities. We ask ourselves, how do our research methods impact the archaeological record? And what role does our personal perception play in reconstructing and explaining the past? Let's take a moment now to closely examine some of the important definitions that relate to the work of American archaeologists. Please remember that archaeology is one branch of American anthropology. It, along with branches like the biological branch of anthropology, the sociocultural branch of anthropology, and the linguistic branch of anthropology, further organize our study of human biology and culture. Here in the New World, archaeology is very much of an offshoot of anthropology. Why? Well, it values the same overall comparative, holistic, and systematic goals of looking at this interrelationship. Now let's turn our attention to these important definitions. Archaeology is the study of human behavior through the examination of material culture. Let me repeat that. Archaeology is the study of human behavior through the examination of material culture. This means that archaeologists are interested in the last 2 million years of human history. Some paleoanthropologists would even extend this further back to 4 or 5 million years ago. Well, whatever the case may be, these are periods in which we as anthropologists believe, that there was a cultural behavior present, one that had a byproduct, and it was a material byproduct. So what then is material culture, and how does it relate to this concept of the artifact? Well, material culture is the data that archaeologists use to explain the past, to reconstruct the past. Material culture, the material byproduct rather, of human culture, includes artifacts. This means that artifacts are part of a much larger expression of human behavior, in this case, material culture. So material culture then becomes any measurable physical material that results from the social and cultural actions of humans. Any of those forms, either fossilized, pre-mineralized, or historic, that in some way, shape, or form can be tied to the genus distinction of Homo. So then, inside of material culture, this data that's so important to the work of archaeologists, we have functional units of analysis, and these tinier functional units of analysis are artifacts. The term artifact can be applied to a wide variety of material types, including garbage or refuse, modified lithics or stone material, bone, whether human or animal, wood, metal, biological waste, even biochemical byproducts. So then how do we fit this aspect of material culture, of artifact, of the work of archaeologists into larger scientific or systematic goals? Well, the nature of artifacts, the nature of material culture and its source really boils everything down to three principal or primary goals. Let me mention them, and then I will go ahead and elaborate on each of these goals. So the first goal, I would say the most important goal in the work of an archaeologist, is the reconstruction of a cultural history. Another important goal is a little bit more intimate than that. It applies to the person, to the family, to the group. This is the reconstruction of past lifeways, the notion of cultural practices, traditions. And then finally, as good scientists, archaeologists attempt to reconstruct cultural laws. These are predictable concepts that will allow us, in a sense, to foretell what we might find at other similar sites. Okay, now let's take a closer look at each one of these important goals. We'll start out with cultural history. When I talk about the reconstruction of a cultural history, I'm talking about the task of reconstituting a kind of culture, being a cultural historian, answering the what, the when, the where of past activities. This helps us better understand the archaeological record and the patterns that we see there. As cultural historians, per se, archaeologists attempt to organize the events and the stylistic qualities, material qualities associated with those events in order to reveal the processes at work in terms of how cultures form and then how they change over time. Now let's take a look at cultural lifeways a little more closely. While cultural historical studies, as I just mentioned, emphasize the unique events in a people's history, the study of lifeways focus on the question of how. How did people live? How did culture change through their lives, through their practices? Cultural lifeways, in a sense, then emphasize the notion of cultural patterns and how they develop from a grassroots perspective over time. Given this, there are many basic assumptions that archaeologists have to make as they're reconstructing, in this case, personal lifeways. These reconstructions reflect an approach, or the approach, that, let's say, a cultural anthropologist might take to a given subject, as he or she is writing ethnography. This means that an archaeologist attempting to understand individual lifeways treats culture rather, as something that is learned, something that is patterned, but always changing, and that it has specific subunits which have their own unique functions, and that artifacts are representations of these smaller functional units. Putting all of this together then allows us to really understand how people lived, everyday people, everyday life. And then there are the established cultural laws. I would say that establishing a cultural law is really kind of the end product of the work of archaeologists, because these cultural laws then help us to better understand other environments, as I said before, and other sites. As is the case with modern scientific discovery and inquiry, archaeologists attempt to understand predictable laws that account for culture change and how this culture change occurs over small or large periods of time. Archaeologists then, as they establish these laws, really wish to gain an understanding of cultural process. What are the mechanisms? What are the almost machine-like gears which are moving in the background to drive culture forward? So in a sense, the establishment of these cultural laws really rejects the idea of any sort of linear development, any sort of linear cause and effect development in the history of a people. In fact, it emphasizes the idea that life, and as it is represented in this case by culture, is dynamic and has a kind of feedback quality to it. Before looking at the overall history of American archaeology, let me take a moment to talk a little bit about bias. Prehistorian Glenn Daniel, working in the Old World, stated that the present state of archaeology cannot be divorced from its past. You may ask what this means. Well, what this means to working archaeologists is that their perspectives, the hypotheses that they test, the theories that they develop, and the reports that they write are all products of their society, the society that they study, and the functional units of analysis that are patterned within that community history. In the next few slides now, we'll be taking a look at the origins of this American school of archaeology. What you will find is that when we begin to delve into the origins, the past that archaeologists today cannot be divorced from, it leads us all the way back to our European roots, our roots in the Old World, and our interest in antiquity. Modern archaeology has its roots in ancient antiquarianism. So what is this philosophy regarding the past? The concept of being an antiquarian means that you're really an amateur. You're interested in the past, you're interested in odd or exotic objects of the past, and you collect them. Now, not everybody practicing this particular philosophy early in the history of archaeology was doing it incorrectly. There were systematic approaches, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. But let's look at the kind of underlying qualities of this philosophy. Antiquarians are interested in the past. They want to reveal or uncover the history that may or may not be lost. They lack, though, an interest in scientific excavation or record keeping. And little care is given to preserving objects and expressions of human behavior in their primary context or in their primary deposit. We gather things, we bring them to museums, or we sell them to collectors, and that is antiquarianism. So, antiquarianism, just to review, it's an amateur pursuit. Early topics in antiquarian circles were really focused on monumentalism, in this case in classical Greece and Rome. Most early and some of the best known antiquarians from before the early Renaissance were Italian by birth. Many were interested in discovering complex civilizations and collecting the objects that best represented them, ultimately from their point of view. Once we reach the early Renaissance in Central Europe, we start to see a different kind of care being given to objects associated with the past. Antiquarian attitudes and sentiments remained. However, there appears to be an increasing emphasis being given to the systematic study of the past. In this case, the emergence of what many archaeological historians recognize to be a systematic period in the study of the past. Once we reach the 18th century, this systematic approach is common to most of the work associated with archaeologists in the Old World. Chiefly among this group, we see the work of J.C. Thomson, born in 1788. He developed a three-age system, a perspective that civilizations pass through three predictable stages or ages of development. They move from being dependent upon objects composed or being made of stone to those objects associated with bronze and forging, and then eventually to iron. Many of Thomson's ideas appearing in the opening decades of the 19th century really followed a developing pattern of thought in most scientific pursuits at the time. This was an evolutionary perspective. He thought of the classical age as being assembled of progressive ideas that were building upon one another, moving from a very primitive expression to a very complex expression. Thomson's three-age system became very, very popular in archaeological circles. We see his three-age system being applied in the 1830s by Boucher de Pesth, who applied these principles to what eventually becomes a dating technique. Pesth's work becomes part of what is today relative dating methods in archaeological circles. He recognized that artifacts, for instance those composed of stone, appeared at deeper stratigraphic layers or deposits from those composed of iron or earlier bronze. Other late 18th century and early 19th century researchers embodying the Thomson perspective included individuals such as Giovanni Belzoni, born in 1778. Belzoni, rather, has been described as a romantic grave robber. His focus, however, was to reconstruct the behaviors that people had or attitudes that people had toward death or dying. And he attempted to organize these patterns of behavior that he witnessed in the graves themselves, graves in Greece, in Asia Minor, in Egypt, as being part of a larger history, a cultural history of how people dealt with death. Overlapping with this systematic period of archaeology was a speculative period. Archaeologists working in this area of speculation, which again appears as early as 1500 and overlaps with the systematic period, attempted to explain the origins of some of the complex civilizations and societies that were being represented in the archaeological record. Their work, extending well into the 19th century, can be understood by organizing their philosophy into three general categories, or applying three basic characteristics to how they approached artifacts and material culture. One of the most important qualities is the use of historical documents. We know that missionaries spreading the good news of Christ's birth and resurrection were moving across the planet throughout much of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries and recording indigenous life. Their records became excellent resources for archaeologists attempting to link what they were seeing in the modern cultural record, who was living there at that time, to the past. Along with the work of missionaries, we see the contributions of early Euro-American explorers, including Charles Darwin. Traveling through unexplored regions across the planet, these early explorers were able to not only record the natural biodiversity of the planet, the plants and animals that inhabited these regions, but also the people, the communities, the languages, the cultures. One of the key concepts that they contributed to this speculation was the origins and cultural connections, or cultural historical connections, to the monuments that they saw. So here in the United States, in the Ohio River Valley, for example, early speculators attempted to understand who built the mounds. Many of these early explorers and the speculating archaeologists who were working with them applied a systematic approach. Again, the systematic period overlaps with the speculative period, to those origin concepts. They mapped, studied, and excavated these monuments that they were finding not only in the New World, but throughout the Old World as well. Overlapping with the latter portions, the latter decades of the speculative period, was a period of discovery and speculation. This really, as you can imagine, grows organically from the explorations of naturalists, from the work of missionaries, which extends very far back into European history, and then, of course, those archaeologists working at the turn of the century, attempting to understand the origin of some of the materials that are being recorded by explorers. Let's take a closer look at these latter decades, and let's segregate them or separate them out into an area or a period of discovery and speculation, one that really begins at the very end of the 18th century and then extends up to about 1840. Between 1800, or the 1780s, and 1840, archaeologists attempting to bring together discovery and speculation turned much of their focus to the New World, to North and South America. An important topic in the New World, whether it was in Mesoamerica, South America, or North America, related to who built the monuments that seemed to stand the test of time. when we look at what modern American archaeologists prize today, much of our focus then has to shift north in the New World, specifically looking at the earthen mounds or the earthen monuments that were built in, as I mentioned earlier, some of these watersheds, the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley, the Great Lakes watershed. Though it is not part of the scope of this course, the history of archaeology, when you begin to delve into it in a much more finite manner, demonstrates that Ohio, given its location, given its history, given its relationship to living tribal nations at that time, becomes an epicenter for this study of ancient native monumentalism, what eventually became known in early archaeological circles as the mound builder myth. This mound builder hypothesis testing school of thought, something that has been really done away with today, focused on the notion of a lost race. Here we see the archaeology of the early 19th century really being part of, or being a product of, the surrounding society, the surrounding culture. When discoverers and those archaeologists speculating on the origins of these monuments took a look at the people that inhabited these watersheds during the 19th century, they denied the connection between what seemed to be a very dynamic, very complex civilization in the past with the tribal groups that dotted the landscape in this early 19th century. We know today that there are strong connections between the civilizations of Hopewell, of the civilizations associated with a Mississippian period in the prehistory of North America, and the tribal nations that inhabit these same watersheds even today. As we approach 1850 and move into the Civil War and post-Civil War era, we realize that an increasing amount of attention was being given to cultural matters in order to understand origins and unlock some of these patterns of artifacts that were associated with native monumentalism. This was a refreshing turn in the narrative that many American archaeologists were producing in the 19th century. It became a time when the work of cultural anthropologists and archaeologists came together. The most important aspect of human social organization really relates to the most common kind when we take a look at the overall history of the planet and our culture. In this case, we'll take a closer look at foraging. Foragers are collectors. They are selective as to the animal and plant resources that they eat and ultimately collect. These plant and animal resources are naturally occurring in their local environment. Plant resources are the largest aspect of their diet and probably the most important aspect of their diet. When an archaeologist attempts to understand the efficiency of this particular strategy, it really falls under a cultural philosophy or assessment type known as an optimal foraging strategy. An optimal foraging strategy is the efficiency of acquiring food resources and the importance of those food resources in the survival of an individual, a community, a culture. Efficiency, in this case, is defined as getting the most calories, the most dietary calories, in the shortest period of time and with the shortest amount of work. This model of assessment when it comes to how people survive in a foraging environment has come to be known as the optimal dietary model. It really began in the 1960s and has become a very important analytical or explanatory model that archaeologists use to understand the artifact scatter that they see in these deposits. Another term that is generally assessed by archaeologists who are studying this foraging lifestyle, again, the most common when we look over the entire breadth of human history, is this notion of catchment. Now, catchment refers to the physical space, the amount of geographical space that's required for a household, a group, a community to meet its daily subsistence needs. Catchment, the geographical space that a community, a group, a household needs to meet its daily subsistence needs. Cultural anthropologists and later archaeologists dealing with foraging cultures, whether they're living or, in the case of archaeology, in the past, have had to really look at the philosophy that exists or underpins a foraging lifestyle, how people are organizing themselves, how they conduct themselves in relation to one another. This has allowed archaeologists, as you can imagine, to kind of fill in the gaps between what they see in the archaeological record and what they know culturally of these hunting and gathering or foraging populations. The philosophy of egalitarianism represents one of the most important forces in the mindset of foraging populations. This philosophy really relates to how people govern themselves, or whether or not there are any group statuses, or if those group statuses are present, how long do they occur and for what reason? Well, what we find in terms of an egalitarian society, and often hunting and gathering societies are solely egalitarian, is the fact that group statuses, if they are present at all, are not power or wealth based and generally temporary. As you can imagine, a philosophy like egalitarianism is very helpful when we are taking a look at artifacts and how they might function within a society. We look at a hunting and gathering campsite, for example, and ask ourselves, are there any elements of power here? And if so, what are they? Is this something we would anticipate in a foraging environment? Does it match their lifestyle in a sense? Does it match or mirror in a sense the local environment? These are the kinds of questions that we can engage when we compare the archaeological record to the living or cultural record. This fact makes American archaeology very unique when we compare it to how archaeologists in the old world have studied the past. This comparison between the present and the past through the lens of anthropology makes American archaeologists very unique. Though the study of a philosophy like egalitarianism and the living cultures such as the Kung of the Kalahari, who utilize this kind of philosophy in their daily life, has given us a real rich spectrum of variability with regards to how individual households and people living within a community conceptualize these equal relationships. We won't get into all of that right now, but I do want to highlight one particular kind of egalitarianism, in this case associated with generalized exchange or generalized reciprocity. Reciprocity, especially of a generalized nature, fits very nicely with an egalitarian perspective or philosophy on life. For this course, what I would like you to remember is that generalized reciprocal exchanges, or generalized reciprocity, occurs where we see gifts or objects that are given to an individual or a group of individuals that one perceives, in this case the giver perceives, to be part of a social group and a responsibility to that group. It is often the case that this kind of very generalized reciprocity will be something that we associate or see with small communities that have significantly equal expressions of status among them or among the individuals within a community. As you can imagine, and as you will see as we start to take a look at specific kinds of archaeological cultures, combining a philosophy of life like egalitarianism with a form of exchange like generalized reciprocity really helps us to understand how objects from one site vary in relation to another, or sometimes the similarities of objects, things that are traded, for example. These concepts can also be applied to biology. It's assumed here in the Americas, and something that we saw in the early ethnographic or cultural record, that not only were things shared between people, resources, objects, symbols, but also people were shared between communities. As we understand more and more of the nature of human genetics, we realize that these exchanges can be actually mapped out between populations, between tribal nations, for example, or communities within those tribal nations today.